Welcome. Happy Friday, everyone. Hope you all are doing well. We're just giving it a moment or two for our community to get settled into this virtual learning space. We have been expecting you, as we do every week during this hour. We don't take it for granted when you show up. And so thank you for being a part of our vodcast community. I am Dr. Nika White. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the proud founder and lead principal consultant at NWC. And NWC is responsible for bringing you this podcast called Intentional Conversations. This is where we intersect dialogue of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging with leadership in business. Shout out to the NWC team who works tirelessly week after week to make sure that we can bring this experience to each of you. If you're joining us right now, but love for you to go to the chat. Let us know where you're joining the conversation from. I see that Kristen has kicked us off. Cincinnati, Ohio, welcome. We're so glad you're here. And as you're going to the chat, or if you're on LinkedIn Live, we welcome you there as well. Go to the comments. Let us know where you're joining the conversation from. And if you also feel inclined to allow this community to connect with you beyond this hour of time, then share your LinkedIn information into the chat. And my team will share my LinkedIn as well. Always excited to connect with each of you and grateful that you are part of our community. Here at NWC, we really do support disability inclusion. So part of the way in which we show up in that regard is to leverage the closed caption feature. So want to make sure that's placed into your hearing in case that's going to be useful to you during this hour of time. If you're part of our Zoom community, then we do love to see smiling faces. So cameras are encouraged, but certainly not required. We're just happy in whatever capacity that you are joining us today. I encourage you to use the chat throughout our window of time together today. That's our way to get proximate to each other, to help share resources and sentiments that we all may be experiencing as we're learning with and from each other during this hour. And so I invite you to use the comment section if you're LinkedIn Live, or the chat if you're part of our Zoom community. Once again, welcome to Intentional Conversations podcast. We're so glad you're here. Enjoy the show. Let the conversations begin, indeed, and that is precisely what we're about to do. If you're just tuning in, this is Intentional Conversations podcast. We also have a podcast that's available of this same show where we extract the audio, and so want to make sure that you are aware of that as well. So we are still in the month of March, which means it is Women's History Month, and so I will continue every day this month to amplify that. But not only this month, throughout the entire year, there's so many incredible women from our past as well as our present day who are contributing greatly to our society, and I want to make sure that we're being intentional to recognize them. So happy Women's History Month. Also, for those of you who have been following us for quite some time, you know that we have 3 LinkedIn learning courses that are out, 2 recently released, and one of which is on navigating AI through an intersectional DEI lens. And a second one that just recently released is Accountability for Leaders, Navigating Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I hope you'll take advantage of those learning resources through LinkedIn, and tell a friend about them if you find it to be of value to your learning journey ahead. As I shared, for those who can't make this hour of time to be live with us during our podcast, but you know that the content was really rich and you want them to be aware of other ways in which they can plug in, I encourage you to share with them that we do have a podcast. So wherever they like to get their podcasts, they still can catch the show, Intentional Conversations. Now, one of the things that I like to do before I formally introduce this week's guest co-host is to give you a little bit of what you have to look forward to in future weeks from our guest co-host that will be joining us. And so closing us out the month of March is going to be Tiffany Castano. And in that Intentional Conversations podcast, we're going to discuss Black women and entrepreneurship, change in the workplace, and good ways to start your own organizations or even your personal DEIB journey. So I hope that you will join us on the 29th for that conversation. And then kicking us off for the month of April is Tara Turk-Haynes. And in that Intentional Conversations podcast, we're going to be talking about equitable hiring practices, embedding DEI into day-to-day operations, increasing belonging and inclusion, emphasizing the importance of not forgetting about the middle managers and operational success. And last, how data transforms ROI when talking about equity operations. So I hope that you will join us on the first intentional conversations in April. And then midway, we're going to be connected with Yvonne Austin, and she is going to be talking about DEIB as wellness, right? And the positive and negative impacts upon mental and physical health and upward mobility and power and privilege. We can't be afraid of those words, how they are catalysts for greater conversations versus conflict. And so I totally agree with Yvonne, and I can't wait for her to share her perspective with us on April 12th. And then the last one that I'll share before I'll get to today's guest co-host is that on April the 19th, we're going to be joined by Dr. Nika. And in that Intentional Conversations podcast, we will discuss culturally inclusive leadership and lived experience, women in entrepreneurship, Black women in leadership, and strategy and leadership in business. And so I hope that you will join us for all of those intentional conversations that are scheduled for the rest of this month and through April. Now, it does me great pleasure to introduce today's guest co-host, and I'm so excited to have her here. We were just chatting before we went live today about how this is our first time officially meeting each other, but we feel like we've known each other for quite some time because we've supported each other's content and work. And when you are practitioners in the space, the world seems so small, so you naturally just gravitate to others that you are in alignment with. And so today is going to be no different. So I am so happy to introduce to each of you Abenaa Haynes, and she is a communications and brand marketing executive with expertise in healthcare, biotech, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and health equity. For over 20 years, Abenaa has helped U.S. and global companies reach stakeholders, influencers, and communities through transformative narratives, dynamic storytelling, and meaningful engagement. Her professional mission is to guide leaders and brands who want to meet 21st century societal mandates head on. To accomplish that, she focuses on driving engagement and transformation through inclusive communications. Abenaa serves as the trusted senior advisor and brand strategist at global agencies, including Edelman, Weber Shandwick, and BCW. Before launching her consultancy, Elise Consulting, she served as a founder and entrepreneur, creating foundational inclusion initiatives at 2 global agencies and building W2O, Real Chemistry's inclusion and health equity practices. Okay, so you know what to do right now if you're part of this community. Find those words of affirmation, find those emojis. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can bring our guest co-host into the spotlight along with me. And one of the things that I want to do before I even jump right in, and I've been practicing this, and so I'm still kind of nervous because I'm like, I'm not sure if I got it 100% correct. And so I want you to start by please pronunciate your name for us once again to make sure that I am getting it right throughout this hour. That is so important to me. And even as many times as I practiced just a moment ago, I'm having this inkling that maybe I did not get it 100% spot on. So I want you to do that for me. And then I'll give you a chance to kind of greet this audience in your own way. Welcome.
No problem. So it's Abenaa.
Abenaa.
Yes. And it is, just so everyone knows, it actually means the girl born on Tuesday. It is a Ghanaian name, and my father decided that he wanted to give me and my brother names that affirmed our cultural heritage. So yes, his medical school roommate was from Ghana, and I got the name Abenaa because I was born on Tuesday.
Love that. Girl born on Tuesday. Abenaa. I love that. That is beautiful. Thank you for sharing that story with us. And thank you for correctly pronouncing your name so that we can make sure we get it right throughout this hour. Now, one of the things that we like to do when we first are engaging with our guest co-host is to give them an opportunity to share with us something that we would not know about them from reading their bio, which we just did, or from looking at their LinkedIn profile. So Abenaa, I want you to please share. Abenaa, I want you to please. Abenaa. Why am I messing this up? Abenaa. I'm writing my own pronunciation right now because this is so important, y'all. Names are important. And so, but I want you to share with us, what can we not know about you that you're willing to share that will allow us to be better connected to you today?
Well, I'll give you something that's in between. So I think from my LinkedIn content, people can probably tell I'm a huge fan of culture and a culture vulture. Some of that just comes from my curiosity, but some of that comes from the fact that I actually grew up playing two instruments. So I used to play both piano and violin, and played both all the way through graduate school and beyond. And they were both ways for me to kind of channel my creativity.
Yes.
But also just in some ways, it was like a good kind of stress relief. In others, it was just really, truly like a different space for me to show up and express myself.
I love that. I love that. Thank you for sharing, Abenaa. That is so fantastic. Okay, so now I want to jump right in. And
Yes.
before we get to like some of the questions that we have, prepared, although we're going to be very agile today, I want to talk about what we're seeing right now in the media, and particularly there's been some additional states that have surfaced. One in particular this week, and I think the latest is like Alabama. But there are states that have passed some laws and legislation that is banning DEI from higher learning institutions. And it seems like many other states are sitting back watching and are right on the peripheral of following suit. And so, what do we say about this? What are we going to do about this? And do we think that this is really a sign of what's to come in the future? Or do we think that this is just a few individuals that are within the state legislation that are getting together and able to just have that level, a high level of influence within their states? What are you seeing, or what are you thinking is going to happen as a result of this?
So I think it's more, I think it's confirmation of the signals and signs that we've been seeing for the last year to 18 months. And the actors behind all of this are literally putting both their money, their voices, and their votes behind a very, very concerted mission, which is to dismantle everything that we know as it relates to DEI, not only in terms of admissions, which obviously we saw with the fall of affirmative action last year, but also just in terms of diversity of thought, diversity of perspectives, and how you truly build inclusive communities on campuses. We're clearly seeing it in all of the red states. I'm not sure it's going to be that strong in the blue states, but I do think it's a very strong signal. And for as much as I think a lot of people have probably just been watching and waiting to see what's going to happen, I think it's a very important inflection point now that I think points to us needing to start to use new and different approaches to combat it.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Abenaa. And what has been really jarring is, and I'll actually see if I can try to pull this up, but I think recently, and you brought this to my attention, is it Ashley White that actually shared this visual? And I'm hoping that everyone can see it. But she shared this visual on LinkedIn, and it really goes to the heart of just showing all of the many different ways that we are seeing DEI being compromised, attacked, and devalued across so many different states. And I was sharing earlier that I'm also in a red state. I'm in South Carolina. That's where we're headquartered. That's where I'm based. And you'll see South Carolina's right in the bottom corner.
Yeah.
We have a bill that proposes changes to diversity policies in higher education. So what I want us to spend some time talking about is, before we jump into some other areas of conversation, is that I've been very vocal about the fact that we can't lose hope. In fact, you probably can't see it fully, but the shirt that I'm wearing today, it says, "Injustice prevails when hopelessness persists. Hope is your superpower." And that's from Brian Stevenson. And so I keep maintaining hope. And I think that as practitioners in this space, even as hard as it gets, when we continue to hear the noise and we continue to see the media headlines, we must maintain hope that this too shall pass, that we can drown out the negativity with positive stories, success stories of the value that DEI is bringing, not only just to those populations that are historically disenfranchised or marginalized, but to everyone. And I want to see that type message be greatly amplified over what we're seeing right now and what we're hearing right now in the media. So How about you? How are you showing up when you see these naysayers devaluing this work and see it gaining speed among, quite honestly, some people?
Yeah. So I think a few things. I think one of the things that actually has given me hope is the fact that in spite of the noise, I still have clients, colleagues, and places and spaces who actually want to do this work.
Yes,
Um,
yes, yes.
and the reason for it is truly through the
Great.
lens of future-proofing companies and brands. And the reason for that is when you look at the demographics, not only of the US, but of the world, we're moving into a majority minority country and world. And we probably already
Absolutely.
there when it comes to our global demographics. So if you actually are looking to operate in a space where the world looks like a multicultural mosaic, you actually have to show up as a company and a brand in a way that is reflective of that, right? I also then go to the financial argument, right? I mean, we've heard a lot of people talk about the McKinsey data, about the value of diversity when it comes to innovation, and I take that one step further. Let's just go straight to the money, right? The
Yeah.
purchasing power, right? There's data from Unilever that talks about the fact that the BIPOC population alone is worth $5 trillion in terms of purchasing power. So
Right.
at the end of the day, you are about making money and you need to reach the people who are going to buy your products. The people are people who look like us and beyond and who identify across a range of different identities, religions, gender, cultures, and beyond. So if you truly are about that dollar, you really truly need to be operating in an inclusive way because you need to be able to resonate with your customers.
100%, 100%. Yeah, the global majority certainly looks like you and I. And if people are, wanting to continue to appeal to those individuals, then they're going to have to make sure that they're also champion this diversity work as well. And so, yeah, the financial data is always important to talk about because that is how most people are influenced and motivated to then change the trajectory of maybe some of the decision making that's happening within their organization. So I totally agree. Okay, so now that we've kind of addressed that, and it may come up again throughout
It's
this
all good.
hour, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us about your DEI journey. How did you discover that this was part of your personal mission? And by the way, we do have some similarities in our background, and that we intersect the work of marketing communications with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I would love for you to expound a bit more on that as well as you're talking about your journey.
No problem. So I like to say that DEI is in my DNA, and it's for a range of reasons. One, I grew up in Trinidad and Tobago, which is a twin island republic in the Southern Caribbean, and it is a country that literally is the epitome of what multiculturalism looks like. I mean, we haven't gotten a whole lot of things perfect yet, but when you actually look at the demographics of the country, it is truly a range of people from different ethnicities, religions, and cultural backgrounds because of our history with colonialism and the different peoples who came to Trinidad and Tobago in so many ways. So I have that as part of my kind of national and cultural heritage, but I also grew up in a family where the tenets of equity were part of and who they were. My father was a health equity pioneer, um, providing free healthcare for people with kidney disease. So I kind of saw that work in action. My mother and my grandmother were both firsts. My mother was one of the first judges, female judges in Trinidad and Tobago, and my paternal grandmother was the first female senator of the Senate that was created in Trinidad after we got independence from the UK.
Mm,
So I kind of grew up with a lot of those models, if you will. And
yeah.
then coming into the world of marketing and communications, I very often was a first or an only in so many rooms in the agency world that I was in. So very early on, I made a commitment to myself to make sure that I would help others as I climbed and really truly wanted to focus as well on transforming the experience for people who've been historically excluded because my industry, like so many others, demographically has been woefully inadequate when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So if part of my kind of mission with this work is to truly do right by everyone who is like me trying to make their way, but also truly help all of the clients that I serve to make sure that they see what the opportunities are for their business and that we ultimately can transform the experience for everyone who's been marginalized.
Yeah, for everyone. I love the emphasis on everyone. This is not a zero-sum game. It
Absolutely.
reminds me, and in my book, I talk a lot about leaving no one behind. That was kind of my mantra, and that was kind of like my passion and entryway to really becoming much more intentional about how I show up to the world relevant to equity and inclusion factors. And so I love that. So let's talk a little bit about the role of communication in cultivating inclusion. I think that as someone who has a Marcom background and also is a practitioner in this space, I don't separate the two. I think that the way in which we help individuals and organizations to think about the constructs of diversity, equity, and inclusion in theory and in practice has a lot to do with how are we telling the story? How are we communicating the facts? How are we helping people to unlearn misinformation? And even how are we kind of creating that buy-in so that the noise, right, when it shows up, like we're seeing now, the positivity of it is so well seated that people are not just gravitating towards that noise. And so, talk to us about how you blend the two and the importance of it.
So I always like to say, I mean, communications is a discipline that helps us accomplish so many things.
Yeah.
It helps cultivate connections, right?
Hmm.
And we're able to kind of create communities. And like you just said, it helps with driving awareness and education, and with through all of those things could drive and power movements, right? And if we are living in a world where there's so much misinformation, disinformation, and polarization, there's so much power in the stories that we tell to not only humanize the experiences that people have, but also just put a face on a lot of these issues, because the minute you start to see what an experience is, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
see how a certain event has impacted someone, you actually start to connect dots in terms of shared experiences around empathy, wanting to support,
Right.
wanting to help. So
Yeah.
that's a very long way of saying as well, communications has the power to actually unite people, even though right now it's dividing people. And if we're operating in a world where we are truly looking to engage and connect with different audiences, like we said, based on the range of identities and cultures that we're looking to reach, you actually need to communicate in a truly inclusive way, right? I
Yeah.
like to say the concept that I know, I'm sure have heard in marketing about general market no longer exists. We're in a multicultural.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to make sure that we show up in the most inclusive ways to reach and touch the people that we want to actually engage.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in total agreement, Abenaa. And so this reminds me, and a little bit of this we talked about before the top of the hour, and that was the importance of language and how words matter. And that obviously has a really critical role in how in which we are communicating around this topic. And as you said, certainly communication drives connection. And through that connection is when we're able to have people to understand perspective and to interrogate their own thinking. And so I would love for you to share just a few inclusive communication best practices that you often will coach folks around who are looking to, again, just improve how they're showing up to the world.
Well, I mean, you just kind of nicely touched on the first one, which is around language and the words that you use, right? Because
Mhm.
we know that words have the power to both harm, but then also uplift and empower, right?
Yeah.
So I really truly believe that when you have to be intentional around the words that you use to make sure that you are both characterizing people, communities in the right and most intentional ways, but also making sure that you're framing their stories in the most positive and human light. And there's been a lot of conversation, for example, in marketing right now about the language that we use to describe different audiences.
Yeah.
Um, and for example, Miles Worthington, whom I'm a huge fan of, actually is moving away from using words like marginalized and historically excluded and referring to underestimated audiences. And he's not
Yes.
underestimated because, like I said, we have huge buying power and we know the value we play in culture, but we haven't been tapped into, right? So there's
Right.
a whole idea around underestimated audiences, right?
Mhm.
So that's like one example of how words can be used to empower. I also really am a proponent of ensuring that we use the right partner with the right voices and the right people, right?
Right.
Because you need to be able to put a face on whatever the issue or challenge is that you're dealing with, and make sure that you give that person a voice and that you
Mhm.
showcase them in the most appropriate way. And then the last thing I always say is look at the places and spaces that you are telling people's stories in, right? Because if at the end of the day, you're looking to both amplify someone or reach
Mhm.
and connect with communities, you have to look at different channels. I mean, you and I connect on LinkedIn, and we know we have a community on LinkedIn, but it may
Mhm.
be that you may need to take something to Instagram. You may
Right.
need to go to Spill. You know, before Elon took over Twitter, I can't call it X. Black Twitter was a phenomenal platform and community,
Mhm.
conversations and amplifying voices. So I always kind of use that framework of three with language, voice, and platform to really truly make sure that people are being as inclusive as they can be.
I love that. Language, voice, and platform. Space and place certainly does matter. Okay, so we are finding ourselves at this trajectory of time to where we really need to go deeper into the DEI conversation, right? It's no longer just about diversity. And furthermore, diversity is already here and happening. So there's nothing that we need to do to create it, right? Which is totally different from inclusion and equity and belonging. And so what should we be focused on right now as this body of work evolves, particularly with all of the tension points around those who are devaluing the work?
So I like to say that DEI is in need of a reframe and a redefinition,
Yeah.
because the work of DEI is so much more than the sum of its parts, right? We know it as an acronym that stands for three things, but at the end of the day, DEI works in service of within companies creating cultures where people feel like they belong and that they can thrive, right? And then when you look at brands and products and services, it's creating all of those things that people feel that they can see themselves in, right? And that they would want to actually support and champion. So that's why I actually now talk about the work through the lens of not only inclusion, but creating inclusive experiences, right?
Mhm.
Because people need, like I said, they need to feel seen, they need to feel heard. And you are able to do those things by creating experiences that actually support all of those things, right? And if I just like think about it through the lens of the workplace, for example, and your point about the zero sum game, if employers want to keep their employees happy, they need
Mhm.
to know that they are working somewhere where they've got people who support them. They've got a company who's going to stand up for them with all of the things going on in the world, right? And they're going to want to know that there's something in it for them in terms of what, you know, the company may stand for from a like CSR or charitable perspective. So that's why I really truly talk about the experience and it really truly being
Mhm.
all encompassing, because it's so much more than just I've hired this group of humans. It's
Right.
how do I make sure their voices are heard? How do they get seats at the table? How do they progress in advance? And what, you know, what's in it for them to stay and thrive?
Yeah, and I think the beauty of that is that it forces us to be much more intentional about the individualized experience, right?
Yeah.
Because no one group is a monolith. And so otherwise, I think that it would be so easy for us to say, we have this group of individuals that are part of these underestimated populations. This is how we deal with them all.
Yep.
And that is not how we deal with them all
Right.
because they all have different needs. They all have different circumstances, different lived experiences. And so I often have been saying, especially of late, that there's a greater responsibility and higher calling on people leaders today because there's no longer this teaching of a one size fits all management leadership approach. You have to get to know your people one by one.
Right.
And and that means not only just getting to know them one by one, but things could change. And so what could look like support for them on one day could be vastly different from a support perspective on a different day.
Yeah.
And so there's a higher calling on leaders. And I just want to get your thoughts on that. Are you seeing the same thing?
I'm seeing the same thing, and it's a pivot actually, I think, from the way that people are accustomed to managing people in terms of
Yeah,
like kind of hierarchical top-down types of engagement, and actually moving more towards a more emotionally intelligent way of
right.
collaborating and working with people. It's truly more around servant leadership and truly collaborative approaches to helping people with their careers and with their work experiences. And I mean, I actually think that that's been one of the benefits of the COVID experience, because we all had to go from in person to working remotely and finding ways
Right.
to work with each other. And we had to
Right.
be flexible in probably ways that we never even imagined. And, you know, like from my own personal experience, I felt that helped me get to know people I worked with a lot better. And people were
Mhm.
actually a lot more supportive in ways that probably would have never happened had we all been in an office. And you know, when I think of all of the data on Gen Z, which is now the like generation we all kind of look to help save this, I mean,
Right.
to have expectations in terms of how they are going to be managed, how their employers engage with them. And I think there's actual upshots to that, because it's truly cultivating a more human experience. Because at the end of the day,
Right.
and we're humans, and
Yeah.
we have fundamental needs to want to be able to be supported.
Yeah, that human-centered approach really is gaining a good bit of attention, particularly around, all of those who are in this space of DEI. And I think that it's because maybe it's a bit more palatable for people to consume because they
Yeah,
hear words like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and those words feel so divisive. And then when you put power and privilege into the conversation, it just all kind of can fall apart.
yeah,
And so, this human-centered approach and the sense of belonging, is certainly softer language that I believe that people are appreciating in this day and time. But I do worry. I worry that if we navigate completely away from, the language that we're used to as we're talking about these things, that
yeah.
there's also some harm that can be done in that regard. And so, what do you tend to share with, organizational leaders who are grappling with that? And maybe they come to you and they say, should we reframe and change the way we talk about it? Or do we stay true to it as to not dilute it? Because I get that question a lot.
Mm.
And I'm curious about how you advise and coach individuals when you're presented with such inquiries.
So for me, it's something that gets customized based on what the challenges that the leader is dealing with.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking in particular of one example where this one leader knew that all the acronyms were literally going to be trigger words for people on the
Yeah.
leadership team, right? But they were hugely supportive of building a certain type of culture. When they talked
Right.
about the culture, it bore all of the hallmarks of DEI. So we actually agreed on structuring a narrative that led with culture, but then pulled in the words around
Mhm.
inclusion, diversity, equity, but
Yeah.
it didn't lead with it from the outset, right? It kind of nicely kind of told a story that led people to realize that they were ultimately doing that work.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. At the end of the day, we want to see the work done, right?
yeah,
We
well,
want
right.
to see the work done.
Well, right. And it was one of those things when it was something like, oh, it was like the aha, we actually do want to do it, right? And it
Mhm.
actually is meaningful and there's actually a benefit to us, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it was done in a way that had the right context, because part of the reason we're seeing all of these things happen with these bills, and we're seeing all of these challenges happening even in like the medical space, for example, is most people don't actually understand what it is they're criticizing or what it is they're trying to dismantle. Right. So being able to put the right context around it, I think, is hugely critical in getting people to actually champion it.
Yeah. So you just brought up another a critical reference that I think it would be important for us to unpack a bit for this community. We are seeing a lot of the challenges that are being placed against DEI finding its way into different types of industries, and the medical field is definitely one. We talked a little bit about this at the top of the hour, but I want to bring this larger community in on that because part of your wheelhouse is health equity, and so help this community to understand the implications of what's happening right now. And I know that dermatology was one area that we touched on before. So share with us what's happening.
Yeah. So I'll share a little bit about what happened in the dermatology world before I bridge into the implications of it. So
Mhm.
the American Academy of Dermatology is the largest academic organization that every practicing dermatologist is a part of. They set all of the guidelines that you see about how certain skin conditions are treated. They host meetings where they focus on a lot of research, and they also showcase different products and so on from different companies. Dermatology is a field in which I think just about 3% of dermatologists in this country are actually Black or African American. So when you think of the fact that we're demographically, that we're about 12, 13% in terms of US population, but we are barely represented in a profession where, you know, there's huge need in terms of all of the different skin conditions that we have. It was actually quite surprising to several physicians I know that there was a petition that was circulated by one of the members demanding that the academy actually sunset all of their DEI initiatives. And they weren't just DEI initiatives focused on trying to get more physicians of color into the profession. It was also to get rid of all of the treatment guidelines that would have ensured that Black patients and patients of color get the right type of care. Because when you look at things like medical illustrations, which some people on the call may have seen on LinkedIn, all of the medical textbooks focus on white skin tones. They don't focus on skin tones of color. So very often people are misdiagnosed, right? Because the way eczema might manifest on a white person's skin is different from how it would on ours. And so their guidelines were focused on addressing all of those issues. So imagine if you sunset all of that, what that would actually mean in terms of the care that patients would get. And the care wasn't great to begin with. So getting rid of it then would set everyone back. And thankfully, as a result of a petition that was signed by hundreds and hundreds of doctors, and then physicians who actually testified before the Academy's board, the Academy actually decided to uphold all of their DEI guidelines because they realized the harms that it would do to patients, and they realized the effect it would have on doctors who might actually want to become dermatologists.
Right. Yeah, so many implications. It's so unfathomable to me to sit back and hear the story. And even when I was reading about it, when it was developing, to think that there were people who found it sensible to believe that this was the right approach. I mean, that's unfathomable, but it's a reality of what took place. And we're fortunate for the voices of those who were willing to fight it, that it's no longer something that's being heavily considered. But yeah, the implications are huge. I have shared with this community, our broadcast community, on a couple different occasions, and I write about it often, that I travel almost 2 hours, there and back to see my Black female dermatologist. And I will continue to do that. There's none in my immediate area, so I will continue to do that. And so it was really jarring to me to hear that there were some efforts in place to try to negate the value of having Black skin tones to be very much a part of the guidelines and the considerations of how in which you treat patients. So these are the reasons that we cannot let the naysayers of DEI gain the speed that presumably it seems like they are among some communities, among some audiences, because there is harm that maybe we're not even thinking about that could be lurking on the other end. And it could be to the detriment of people's lives, their livelihood and their lives. And so I am a big fan of continuing to push the health equity conversation. I'm glad that you're in the space to do that the way in which you do. Okay, so I have more questions for you, and we're going to get to those questions, but I first want to alert the audience that if you have questions or comments that you would like to present to our guest co-host today, then I welcome you to do so. If you're part of the Zoom community, you can let me know that you're interested in presenting your question live by using the raise hand feature, and then I will call on you, invite you to unmute yourself, and add you to the spotlight. Or if you want to just share it into the chat, we will present those questions as time permits on your behalf. If you're joining us by LinkedIn Live and you would like questions to be presented, then go to the comment section. We're watching that and we're bringing them in to our topics of conversation. And so while you're percolating and getting your questions prepared, I'm going to go to the next question, and then I'll begin to take audience questions. I want to talk about the importance of having like a DEI brand, right? Many of us know the importance of having a brand in general, and whether we feel like we have a brand or not, we do. It may not be an intentional one, but we have a brand. And I think the same holds true for organizations that are doing the DEI work, right? And so you advise and coach clients and individuals who are interested in building a really solid DEI brand for their organizations? Is it something that could benefit them? Is it something that is hard to do? What are those steps that you normally guide them on to do so?
So the first thing I always say is, rather than having a DEI brand that is separate and distinct from your company, it actually needs to be part of the company identity and brand. Right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because very often, I mean, you see companies kind of separate them, but at the end of the day,
Sure.
whatever you do as it relates to DEIB should be part of who you are. So it's part of your mission, it's part of your vision, it's part of your values, right? That
Mm-hmm.
embed is absolutely critical, right?
Excellent.
Because you can't be like, for example, I grew up in the healthcare space, right? And very often a lot of companies in the space talk about putting patients first, right? But then when you put patients first, that means you're putting all patients first, including patients who are
Right.
from different backgrounds, right? So when you look at how some companies in that space actually talk about themselves, and I like to use Genentech as an example, they actually, when they talk about their mission and why they're pursuing like a healthier world and healthier lives for everyone, that language and the like supporting narrative actually ties into their commitments to inclusion and equity. The two have to
Mm,
come together. Because I always say to clients, in a perfect world, they wouldn't need people like me or people like you, because
right.
everybody would be doing this work, right? And it would be
Right.
part of everything. We're not there,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So the first thing you need to do is actually look at your mission and vision and see how that actually supports what you're doing with DEI, and the two need to come together, right? Because when you do that, everything that you do in terms of the internal work with your employees, but the products that you're building, right? Or the services that you're offering are all being built and created through that lens of inclusion.
Yes. Yes. So well stated. Thank you. And it reminds me, I have had a client before that early on in their journey of DEI work, they felt so inclined to fly below the radar. And it was because they felt like, I don't want to force this on people. And I could appreciate what the thinking was, but I also realized that when you're starting out, you almost need to over communicate on how in which you're showing up to the work and that it is a value set for your organization. And so I bring that to the conversation because I think that sometimes that is a question that many organizations may try to dissect. Do we do this in a way that feels more organic, or do we do this in a way that's intentional? And I think it's a both and. You have to try to find some middle ground there for it to really have a level of stickiness to it, where people are believing what you're communicating and what you are wanting to be felt as people experience, the organization.
100%.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so we do have some questions that have come in, and this question is from Nika Cruz. Thanks for joining us, Nika. I've seen this argument a lot where DEI is good for business because of the financial implications. Is that how we want to frame DEI? Then it's not really about learning and accepting, but about seeing diverse people as a means to profit. I feel like this doesn't change the culture of the environment, and she's just seeking some thoughts on that. So,
So the
what would
first
you
thing
say?
I think is, we now live in a world where I think companies actually need to be able to show that they can make money and do good at the same time.
Yeah, yeah,
And knowing and knowing that those two kind of statements need to come together at the end to me, you're not, if you approach it through that mindset, you're not necessarily looking at people as a means to an end, i.e. that profit, right? Because if at the end of the day, like we were saying earlier, we're about future proofing our companies, we're about making sure that we are supporting our communities, that we are ensuring that we're all having a sustainable future, right? You need to generate revenue, but you need to actually partner with the people you need to reach and give people the opportunity to make that money as well. I think there's benefits and value to both.
yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And I just want to point out that Wendy John, a part of our community today as well, is sharing Nika's sentiments and really appreciated the question, shared a Harvard Business Review article. But what I want to add to this question in this discussion is that I too agree that it is a both and. I think that what has gotten us to this point of progress within just the broad work of DEI is not necessarily going to allow us to be catapulted to the next level of work. We have to get much more strategic, much more intentional, and that requires us thinking about what are the driving motivators for different audiences that we're trying to bring along. And so I do think that if we're talking to a lot of the C-suite folks, they're going to want to understand as they're prioritizing all the things, how is this going to directly impact the bottom line? And so it's not that if you are communicating the value set in that regard, that you are negating just the humanity aspect of it, right? I think it's about being strategic. I often tell organizations that you have to really talk about it as the value proposition, which includes the value to the individual as well as the value to the organization. And they both are equally important, right? And so, I think that understanding what are those driving motivators of all of those key stakeholders that we want to engage in this work, what are those factors? And then being strategic about how in which we are communicating, to those individuals. And so I do think it's a both and thank you, Wendy, for sharing the article as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not like, I mean, you literally, and this is where the marketing comes in, right? Look at like your customer journey and see what motivates everybody. Everybody wants to know what's in it for them, right? And as we were saying, this is not a zero-sum game. And if the goal is to make sure that everyone can win, right, you need to then kind of dig into all of those motivating factors that are going to want people to be a part of the journey.
Absolutely, 100%. I also akin it to the process of developing your employer brand. There's going to be multiple things you're going to talk about as you're trying to, recruit talent and you're trying to convince talent that you are an employer brand of choice. And, hopefully what these organizations are doing is getting to know what are the factors that really motivate this particular person that you're after, that you want to join your organization to say yes.
100%.
And so, it's just another example of how strategic we need to be around our messaging and our communication strategy, just in general, as it relates to DEI.
I just want to say an stand to that, which is, one of my friends, Mita Malik, very famously said, your employees are your most underestimated audience, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, when you think of the why behind not only doubling down on DEI, but making sure that you evolve it in a way that's meaningful, it's because you actually need to make sure that you are serving your employees. And
absolutely,
because if you don't, they will revolt, just like the employees at OpenAI revolted a few months ago. So I do think that's a very important point for folks to consider.
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. Okay, so I'm going to go back to health equity. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to go back to the health equity conversation. And coming up next month on the 9th, you have a panel discussion that you're participating in that certainly relates to health equity. So tell us a little bit about that.
So I will be part of the Power of the Pack, which is a LinkedIn live content series hosted by the Female Quotient. And they often lean into topics that are relevant. And so this one is about employee wellness and the importance of making sure that people have equitable access to healthcare within their workplaces. And the whole conversation around well-being, as we know, has become a huge priority on the heels of COVID, also considering the mental health crisis that we're in. And, like employers now actually have a role to play in making sure that their employees not only have the best access to the like insurance policies, but that they actually have access to programs that support their overall well-being. So my part of that conversation is to really talk about the ways that companies need to think about creating equitable options for employees, because it goes beyond the obvious. So I don't want to give away too much about what that conversation is going to be, but I mean, I think we've all started to see some of the requests that people have asked for in terms of like hybrid work, in terms of being able to have certain types of maternal health benefits, benefits as it relates to reproductive care. So we'll be digging into a lot of those topics and more. So it's on April 9th, and I think they've already started posting it on LinkedIn. So would love for folks to join.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I have seen it, and I'm going to ask my team to see if we can source that and place it into the chat for those who may be interested in joining. The Female Potent is a very great entity that provides a lot of great content to the broader community. And so I'm sure it's going to be a great program. So, and what it reminds me of is that, what we talked about earlier, the human-centered approach. When organizations are starting to lean more into the well-being aspect, the radical self-care, and how to make sure that they are encouraging that type of culture, because let's face it, right now there's a lot of criticism about many workplaces being having an overwork culture, right, to where people cannot seem to ever be caught up, and that is weighing on people's mental health, and of course that can impact also our physical health. And so I think it's just another way for organizations to really understand the value of being a human first and center type of organization. Now, this is an election year. What are you sharing with some of your clients about what they need to be thinking about or doing just to make sure they are prepared for this election year, and what that could entail in terms of just workplace civility and the stress and all the things that people are going to be holding? Yes, all the things.
So I keep saying you got to be ready and stay ready, right? At the end of the day, I mean, we've started to see how contentious this will be.
Yeah.
And if you weren't prepared in terms of actually having a framework that showed what you're willing to speak about or not, and where you're gonna actually articulate that and who those voices are gonna be, you gotta get ready. The other part of that is, and you just touched on this, which is making sure that you create the spaces that you need for your employees who are going to want to have those safe space conversations, and kind of setting the rules of engagement around that, right? Because we've lost the art of civil conversation and civil discourse, but we are going to be coming into a season where we're actually going to need to be able to engage in that, because people are going to have conversations. I think companies also are going to need to, again, kind of lean on their employees to figure out what it is that they need and want, and then kind of create whatever policies and communications frameworks that they need to have in place to show that they're supporting their people.
Yeah, absolutely. How are you supporting your people? How are you also making sure that your people are upskilled around navigating difficult conversations when we know that there could be different perspectives, right? That is really critical. And we can't assume that just because we have a person with the title of leader in our organization that they know how to do that, right? Those power skills are critically important. And now is the time to start really upskilling around it, because you want to make sure that you're not avoiding the conversations, but yet and still you are, providing the level of respectability that needs to occur when people are having those types of conversations. Okay, so I'm still looking to see if there's any questions come through, because y'all know I could just keep going. And we did share the power of the pack, by the way, so I wanted to bring that to everyone's attention. Okay, so Abenaa, I have a question for you, and this is about resource allocation. One of the things that I hear a lot of, like BRG leaders, ERG leaders, depending upon the organization's different nomenclature for that, but they will say, okay, my organization is still committed to DEI, but we have had to reallocate some dollars, right? And so that in and of itself could be a whole separate conversation, but just stay with me here. But when they find themselves in that predicament where they're having to do more with less, what are some ways in which you are advising those leaders to really try to continue to create meaningful and impactful programming and initiatives that may not necessarily require such a heavy financial lift?
So I say two things. One, you've got to just be ruthlessly focused on what the most important priorities are in terms of your activations and programming, so you can maximize that you have. But this is where allies in your organization also come into play, because for as much as ERG and BRG leaders carry the water on a lot of this work, the only way it's impactful is if the executive sponsors and others within their organizations are actually locking arms and supporting them on it, right? So any opportunity a company has to actually start to share the responsibility of that beyond the ERG, I think is also critical. And that also helps start to embed the work throughout an organization versus relying on a singular group of people to actually do the work.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So don't get weary, get creative, but then also rely on your sponsors and others who have influence in the organization to help also to solve that for you. One of the things I often tell the executive sponsors of BRGs and ERGs is that the success of the BRG in which you're responsible for is ultimately, it's your responsibility. You're accountable for that. So what are you doing to make sure that they're being set up for success? And so don't go at it alone. Also make sure you're talking to those allies and sponsors in your organization to help you problem solve.
Mhm.
I want to move quickly because I know that next month we are going to be recognizing from a national observance the Asian American um, Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And so, what are some ways in which you're seeing organizations really meaningfully acknowledging and observing and recognizing those communities? And I'm sure that there's probably a lot of folks that are maybe last minute because this is next month. Well, it's actually in May, but I'm sure there's a lot of people who are probably sitting back thinking, well, gosh, is it too late for me to plan and pull something off that's meaningful? And what would you say to that?
So I don't think it's too late because today is what, March 22nd? You
Huh?
got time. And
Mm.
actually, you got to like maximize the time you have now to figure out what you
Yes.
can do. You know, I actually firmly believe now that companies need to focus on how they support and spotlight their people from that community first and foremost, right?
Right.
Because all too often, you know, across demographics, people don't always get recognized, but we also know when you look at the data in terms of the AAPI community, I think there are a lot of assumptions that are made in terms of how folks identify and how they want to show up in organizations. So
Mhm.
I say, you know what? Focus on really truly telling the stories of the people who are in your company and the people who are part of your communities. If you
Mhm.
want to then start elevating and amplifying, like we were talking about earlier, externally, make sure you do so in an authentic way, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, we've seen this across cultural observances. Seemingly,
Yes.
when they hit, you start to see people you never knew actually existed in an organization, right? So if it is that you want to do that, make sure you do it in a way that's true to you and true to how you've shown up as an employer brand. Um, I also think that it's in instances like this where if you know that there are programs or initiatives that you could actually support to help elevate the community and also make sure that
Mhm.
you're supporting causes that are important, this is where
Right.
your charitable donations come into play, right?
Hmm.
Because it's not just about showing the people, it's again putting your money where your mouth is in meaningful.
Absolutely. In meaningful ways, absolutely. So well stated. And I'll just share that the theme for this year for AAPI month is advancing leaders through opportunity. And that theme in and of itself, amplifies all that you just shared with us about where the focus should be. And then actually, this is the theme that's been in place since 2021. So it's continuing to build, through this year. So yeah, it's not too late. Certainly jump on it though, because time is ticking, but
Yeah.
make sure it's meaningful and make sure you're directly trying to impact the education aspect and awareness aspect that others in your particular organizations may need to know how to best support and show up for the AAPI community. Okay, so we are about 3 minutes from the top of the hour. And so, one of the things that I often like to do before I close out is to give our guest co hosts the opportunity to share with us what's on the horizon for them. What is anything that I have not asked you about in this hour of time that you're feeling a lot of energy around and you want to socialize? What else can you share with us that would be important for us to know?
Um, I actually want to give a shout out to another cultural observance that not everyone may be aware of, but I think it's important, which is West Indian Heritage Month, which is in June,
In
right? So
June.
there are so many people across a range of different verticals, companies, and so on who come from the region. And we've made huge contributions to the diaspora and beyond. And I am here to celebrate my community wherever I can. So I always want to make sure that people are aware that that observance does exist. And it's important to honor and recognize. And then you asked what I'm excited about on the horizon. Um, I'm actually excited to spend some time with my family. We have Easter coming up. I have a very, very I'm trying to figure out the right word to describe. My niece is irrepressible, and she makes all of the family plans and creates all of these exciting things. So I'm intrigued to see what itinerary I'm going to actually get from my 14-year-old niece coming up in the next week.
I love that. I love that. Well, I certainly hope that that time is going to be really special for you and your family. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you for continuing to give us hope, right? Because we need to keep that.
Yep.
Hope is our superpower. Don't forget that message as we go into, you know, the weekend and on into the future weeks. And we have just enjoyed having you here on the show today. So thank you so very much. I hope that you all will follow and that you will catch the upcoming panel on April the 9th. We've also placed information into the chat about that, as well as if you are interested in connecting on LinkedIn, you can do so. Abenaa's information is actually in the chat. And so thank you so much, everyone. Have a great weekend and look forward to seeing you all back here next week.